When we want to add CSS or JavaScript or images to our HTML files, then what we want to do in the end is we want to add so-called static content. Static because this CSS or JavaScript code is not influenced by Python. It's not changed or generated by Python. Instead, we as a developer, or maybe the front-end developer in our team, if we're working in a bigger team, prepares that code, and then it's that code which we can attach to our HTML file, so to say. And of course, that's also such a common requirement that Django has built-in support for that, because you did learn that Django is a framework with batteries included, so packed with features. And support for static files is one of those features. For that, you need to create another subfolder, also here, again in my app folder, and that's the static subfolder. And that should be named static because Django will look for such a static folder. And that folder then should hold all your static files, your static assets needed by your project. Again, you should use the same strategy as with the templates and create a subfolder which repeats your app name, because just as with templates, all those static files will be merged into one big static folder behind the scenes, and hence you could have clashes between different apps. So here I'll repeat that app name in a subfolder. And then in that subfolder, you can of course have more subfolders, like a styles subfolder for the CSS styles, and a scripts subfolder for the JavaScript files if you have any, and maybe a images subfolder if you have static images. But here I just have some static CSS code. And because this is no CSS course, we got separate resources and courses on that if you're interested, I provided some CSS code for you, and therefore attached you find a base CSS file which you can copy into your styles folder to get some basic styles which we'll need throughout this course project. So now that makes the file available, but just to Django in our project in general. It's not auto-injected in our HTML file. Instead, that's something which we now have to do on our own, and we do it by using a special feature of the Django templating language, which we'll now use. Up to this point here, we just have a standard HTML file. And the problem with that is that this is a static file, which sometimes is what you need, but which often is not what you want, because you want to have some dynamic data. And here I would like to add an import of this base CSS file, a link to this base CSS file, which should be resolved dynamically, so that I don't have to enter the full URL to that file, but I leave it up to Django to figure out where this file will be stored exactly once that server is up and running. And therefore I'll add this link HTML element, but for this ref attribute, I now don't want to hardcode the URL myself, but I want to let Django figure out the correct URL. And that is a feature built into Django, and we can now write some special syntax here in this HTML file to use the Django templating language for unlocking and for using this feature. Here we can add single curly braces opening and closing, and after or in front of these curly braces, add a percentage sign. And now between those opening and closing percentage sign curly braces, we now type static, then single quotes, and between those single quotes, the path to the static file that should be added here without the static folder name. So in my case, where I stored this base CSS file in a styles folder, in the meetups folder, I type meetups/styles/base CSS. And this will then tell Django that here it should dynamically inject the real URL to that file, as it will be served by the server later. Now to unlock this feature, we need to add something at the top of this HTML file, and that's another command which is also between these percentage sign curly braces, And that's the load command where we load this static feature to unlock this static command down there. And with these special code lines here, with these special expressions, we're using the Django templating language. Because all those HTML files here will be parsed by Django before they are returned as pure HTML to the browser. That's what this render method, this render function will do. It will not just read that HTML content and immediately return it. Instead, it will parse it and it will find special instructions like this, execute them, because that's a feature built into Django, and then return the finished HTML file or the finished HTML content to the browser. Now, it is worth pointing out that loading static files and letting Django infer and resolve URLs to static files is one thing we can do with this templating language, but not the only thing and arguably not the most important thing. Very soon in this course, we will use this templating language to output dynamic content and send back different HTML responses to different users with different content possibly. We will be able to load data from a database and inject that into this HTML file so that based on which data was requested from the database, the same HTML file might be used as a shell, but the actual content on the page, for example, the actual title or the actual text being output on that page, will differ based on that data we fetched. But we'll see that in action very soon. I just wanted to mention it already, that that's this main purpose of this templating language and why that feature exists. It allows us to predefine HTML content and have dynamic segments, dynamic pieces in that content, which will be swapped out for actual data, like this URL to this CSS file here, when Django renders this template and then sends it back to the browser. And hence, if you now save everything and you quit your development server and you restart it thereafter, then if you reload your page, you should see a changed output there. You should see that there is a slight purplish background color and the font's changed. If you don't see that, open the DevTools and force a hard reload, and you should then see it. And that's now our CSS file having an effect. And if we view the actual page source, then of course here we don't see those strange instructions which we wrote here, but we see just some standard HTML code, and that's the URL Django resolved for us and Django injected for us into this HTML file because of this instruction here. And that's how we can add static files and how we can take our first steps into the Django templating language.